development.
Is being recorded.
Greetings and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development. This is the first session in this year, and so I wish you Happy New Year. And of course, also to China. I'm George Mutalemwa in Tanzania, moderating this session on behalf of the Africa Peace and Development Network, MAMA. Our network this year got a new name, that is Solidarity for Peace and Development. Its acronym is the same, MAMA, or in Swahili, Mshikamano wa Amani na Maendeleo. The theme today is Theory from the South, debates about decolonization. So today, we are going to start with a few introductory words from Egon Spiegel, Professor Egon Spiegel of the University of Fechter, and Professor Liu Cheng of Nanjing University in China. And if Professor Lester Kurtz is here, we'll also say a few words before our speaker begins the presentation. And the speaker today is Professor Jean Comaroff. Professor Jean Comaroff is the Alfred North Whitehead Professor of African and African American Studies and Anthropology at Harvard University. She's honorary professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Her research, primarily conducted in Southern Africa, has focused on the interplay of capitalism, modernity, and colonialism. I first met Jean at the University of Ghent in Belgium last year. And so this is my second time I'm meeting you, Professor Jean Comaroff, and what a pleasure. Yeah, and really thank you so much really for finding time to be with us. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Jean Comaroff. And as I put it, I will now start with Professor Egon Spiegel saying a few words, and then Professor Liu Cheng. Professor Egon, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, George. Dear colleagues and friends, dear participants, and dear everybody. As one of the fathers of our webinar, I am allowed to say something about our project. It was 2019, some days before Christmas time, when Liu Cheng, George Mutalemwa, and me were meeting in my university in Fechter, Germany, in order to foster our cooperation. In the context of our Christmas meeting, we considered the offer of an online seminar to introduce interested people in peace studies. After our meeting, we asked our colleague and friend Lester Kurtz to participate and support our project. Immediately, he affirmed. Since this time, the webinar is based on a network of 4 peace researchers from 4 countries, actually from 4 continents. We located the webinar in Africa, exactly in Tanzania, in Mwanza. By the financial support of the government of Lower Saxony in Germany, we could not only create the webinar, but a lot of other things. All of this couldn't be realized without the work of Dr. George Mutalemwa. Since nearly 5 years, he continuously is moderating the webinar with a lot of preparation, communication, correspondence, a lot of talks with colleagues asking to become a speaker in the webinar all over the world. Therefore, we should give him a big round of applause and express our gratitude. Thank you so much, George, dear George. And thank you so much, dear speakers, all over the year and all over the world. And last but not least, and especially you participants. The webinar, I think you will d'accord with me, is a unique project. Sorry, Les, I don't know if Les is just now participating. Les, when I remember your actually realistic perspective at the very beginning of the webinar, that we could offer it maybe only once a month and only for a short time. But we all are surprised on the resonance and the length of the project. And more than that, the contents of the sessions, the expertise, and the books based on the webinar. There must be a real need on the webinar in the past, and I think, though, in the future too. The continuation of the webinar depends especially on the activity of our beloved George Mutalemwa and the reception of the participants, of you. Let's continue. All the best to the unique webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed, Egon. And let me now turn to Liu Cheng for a few words, and then Lester Kurtz will also say a few words, and then we invite our speaker. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. As Professor Egon speak, he talked about the background of this webinar. It's about 5-6 years ago. I get invitation by Egon, ask me fly from China to Germany. Just one thing for discussion and the possibility to create a webinar or workshop for intro peace studies to African countries. But at that time, actually, I don't think it will be successful for this proposal to cooperation, China, Germany, and African. But I did it because this is for peace. I couldn't refuse to go to fly from a long way from China to Fichte, Germany. But as Egon said, even the proposal approved by the German local government, I couldn't believe this kind of webinar can continue about more than 5 years. Actually, I couldn't believe. So people is very important. So I really thankful George. The key person is very, very important, even only one person. So this is reminding me to think in China. In the very beginning of the new century in China, nobody knew about peace studies. But at that time, just for some opportunity, I'm learning a little bit about the peace studies from Britain, Coventry University. And I make a decision. I want to introduce peace studies into China, especially in academic field. So I will tell you all of you, today in China, all university know about peace studies. also a lot of schools, they're also learning something about peace education. So even China is a big country. We have 1.4 billion population. So I really hope the peace studies, not any African, not any China, not any focus on Africa, not any focus on China. We should connect with the peace of our countries, of the world together. So in China, we are just the Chinese New Year is coming. In the name of Chinese New Year is called Spring Festival. Spring is coming, China, also in a lot of places in the world. Spring is the season of hope. We need hope, but the peace is all of hope. But the peace of the hope only contributed by practice, by action, by every people. So I really hope this kind of webinar will continue 6 years, 7 years, but this is not very important. The very important, this webinar can connect with the out of African, like the peace studies in China. Today, we connect the peace in China with especially Japan, Northeast Asia, even EPRO countries, something like that. Okay? So just now I want to say last word he said. So 5 years ago, we really make a right decision to create this proposal. I really, really thank all of you contributions, especially Egon, George, and Nesta. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leo, for the wonderful words. And now, please, Lester Kurtz, if you can say a few words, that would be appreciated.
Okay, I'm just the add-on here to this wonderful collaboration, and I'm so glad that George Mutelemwa and Egon Spiegel and Liu Cheng added a token American on the end of their list, and it's been a real pleasure for me to collaborate with you folks. I'll try to be brief because we have an important speaker coming up here, but let me mention just real quickly, I'm a qualitative guy, but I've got some statistics for you. Among the top 200 scientific journals, 60% were based in Western Europe, 32% based in America. So 92% of the leading journals originate in what we normally call Western centers of knowledge. I'll send you the link to the article in the chat later. 4% in Asia, 1% Latin America, and 0.5% in Africa. So Western knowledge, the infrastructure for research and so on, it's a recolonization process. And this webinar is a major, we're like the little mice gnawing away at the wall. My East German friend once told me. So we're a little mouse gnawing away at the wall, and they don't pay much attention to us, but someday the wall is going to come tumbling down. And sure enough, it did. So thank you for this wonderful event and this collaboration, and look forward to today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lester, for your kind words. And so I thank you once again, everybody, for your participation. And now it's time for Professor Jean Comaroff to speak to us. You're welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, George, for the invitation. And thank you very much for the privilege of joining you in conversation. My husband and I run an uncannily similar workshop, and we have found that it has propelled itself out of the sheer necessity to talk across existing divides. And for many of us, living in dark times and in relative isolation, these conversations are hugely important in building bridges and circulating ideas. So today I'm going to talk in a way that follows very much on what Les has just said. And it's about a book that my husband and I wrote on theory from the South, but is really a way into talking about this vexed question of decolonization, which is everywhere and nowhere. When I was back in America about 6 months ago, I saw a notice on a student notice board which said, "Decolonial yoga, please join." And I realized that this term had now traveled so far that it was in danger of losing all discrimination and meaning. So when John Comaroff and I wrote the book Theory from the South in 2011, in the wake of the global recession of 2008, we argued that in the current moment, it is from the so-called global South that we get privileged insight into the workings of the world at large. It is a Southern vantage, we suggested, that offers the fullest empirical picture of the long history of the present. And it is from here that theory work and efforts to understand ought to be coming, at least in major part. For while Eurocentric history sees the South as lagging behind the North, in many ways, it's the North that is currently, I would argue, playing catch-up to the South, destined to repeat its experience of the effects of imperialism and dispossession, be it in the onset of growing racial inequality, the rise of tribalism and ethno-nationalism, the ascent of authoritarian rulers, or the experience of precarity, of homelessness, joblessness, and the informalization of the economy. After all, metropole and colony were co-constitutive elements of the making of the modern world, early and late, and I don't believe for one moment that colonialism is behind us. Formal colonies were experimental zones, sources of value and innovation for modern nation states in the North. At the same time, the colonized were excluded in large part from sharing the value or being accorded the real rights of that long recurring history of colonial modernity. As Aimé Césaire observed long ago, European colonialism was less a civilizing mission than a system that exploited and dehumanized both the colonizer and the colonized. And as a consequence, colonizers are often destined in the longue durée to relive at home many of the features that they inflicted on populations on the so-called periphery. In that sense, the colony often experienced first what in later stages of the post-colonial era was the fate of the rest of the world. Our late modern neoliberal time has seen the globalization of the logic of empire, not only in relation to the so-called developed and underdeveloped world, or the globalization of the division of labor, but in the fact that many metropolitan nation states have taken the internal form of settler colonies, divided between racially marked unequal zones of North and South. You see this in the US, you see this in the UK, you see this in Italy. I will not even venture into the Middle East for now. Viewing this recent history from the vantage of the post-colony, in my case, from Africa, I'm sitting now in Cape Town, where I spend most of my time. I'm only a migrant laborer in America. This invites us to see familiar things in unfamiliar ways. So while what I'm saying may strike you as extreme in many ways, it's an exercise in defamiliarization and denaturalization that we were trying to bring off. Thus, in if the making of modernity has been a prolonged worldwide process, its engines of decisive development were not permanently fixed in any one site or center. C.L.R. James, after all, has argued that it was the enslaved in Haiti in the late 18th century who ushered in the age of modern universalism, by insisting that the vision of liberty, equality, and fraternity framed in the bourgeois revolution in France actually pertained to all mankind, themselves included. Haiti at the time was the world's most profitable site of wealth generation. Likewise, W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction offered what is perhaps the first truly holistic account of the capitalist world system, which in the late 18th and 19th century rested on the backs of workers in sugar and cotton plantations in the New World. In other words, the history of such systems can often be more comprehensively seen from beyond its presumed centers. But in Theory from the South, we tried to do more than just turn the story upside down, thus to leave the North-South dualism intact. We hope to stress that many of the emergent features and concealed contradictions of modernity were as readily perceptible in the colony as in the metropole, and that the former was often the site of the production of the ways and means of the latter. But we argued, in addition, that in the onset of the 21st century, world historical processes were visibly altering received geographies of core and periphery, relocating to its margins some of the most innovative and energetic modes of producing value, and thus the driving impulse of contemporary capitalism. And also, I would add, humanistic thinking and questions of what we might mean by peace. So you see new formations, for instance, in China, or capitalism with Asian and Chinese characteristics. But you also see in East Africa, in Kenya, for instance, the so-called leapfrogging of technical innovation that has taken place in Africa, with the emergence of these super app forms like fintech, digital banking, and M-Pesa economies and so on. So there are these innovative places that come out of a history of deprivation. The axes of trade and development in the world have in many respects moved from the vertical, the north-south, to the horizontal. Engagement, for instance, between Africa, China, India, Korea, Turkey, South Korea and Turkey. Meanwhile, the waning economic and moral sovereignty of old empires centered on the US, the UK, or Russia is reconfiguring the format of the post-World War II international order into a kind of militant isolationism with new imperialist forms of regionalism, the so-called silo effect. It is in this light that we propose that the history of the present might perhaps be more acutely grasped, alike empirically and theoretically, from the vantage of what I'm calling the South, and I'll get to this now. As this implies, the idea of the South is itself a slippery category. We're not implying merely here scholarship from a particular geographical location, although if that is included. Many of our scholars sitting here bear signatures that are simultaneously North and South and East. Our critical edges are honed not from single placements, but by multiple displacements. Many of us are various kinds of migrants, voluntary and otherwise. There are multiple movements away and towards. It is, as Achille Mbembe has stressed, the question of the South is less about national branding of scholarship than the effect of the South and its history on theory, the effects of experiencing the world from beyond its self-proclaimed centers. In fact, it's a product of what Homi Bhabha called eccentricity, using that in various senses, of a structural logic that is beyond the Archimedean gaze of Europe or North America, or as Lewis Gordon put it, relocating the geography, the center of geography of reason. So how might this approach relate to more recent debates in the human sciences on decolonization? In its most conventional usage, decolonization implies a process of undoing colonialism, dismantling the formal institutions of colonial government and exploitation, granting independence to former occupied territories, as occurred with the withdrawal of colonial powers like Britain, France, and Belgium from territories in the South after World War II. But increasingly, in the late 20th century, decolonization has come to mean something beyond formal political independence, focusing on the enduring translocal structures of metropolitan economic and legal domination, ownership and extraction, and most recently on the lingering effects of Western hegemonies and narratives that claim universal relevance at the cost of suppressing indigenous knowledge and local worldviews. Here, the struggle is focused on decolonizing institutions such as universities and schools by seeking to diversify curricula, removing epistemic biases, and a process that's actually proven to be very tricky and contentious in practice. Any of you who've tried to think about what it might mean to decolonize a syllabus that's been in practice in existence for quite a while and presumes Eurocentric foci will know what I mean. To open up some of these arguments, I'll consider a few of the key debates in decolonization in relation to theory from the South, which itself covers similar ground in many respects in its vision of decolonization, but differs in some key respects, I would argue. Much of the most recent mobilization around the question of decolonizing knowledge, the disciplines, and the university as an institution that has occurred in the UK and in Europe have been spurred by critical interventions on the part of students and scholars from the post-colonial South, India, Latin America, Australia. Many of them migrated to the North and experiencing this kind of friction of where they come from and where they are now. Most recently, this impetus emerged out of the campus protests in South Africa in 2015, called Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, a movement that sought actively to determine what it meant to decolonize a university as a key site of social and intellectual production and reproduction. One of the key conversations sparked by these events took place in the UK at Oxford, where the imprint of Rhodes still looms very large, and at Cambridge, especially in the Department of Anthropology at Cambridge, where colleagues set out to examine what might be the implications in practical terms of decolonizing a discipline like anthropology or history, and to do so in the light of the looming presence of the memorials and the finance and the various kinds of forms of honoring of rapacious colonizers that supports many of us. The names of the buildings we work in, the statues we work by, and so on, are all famous colonizers who've been generous to these elite institutions. But where did that generosity come from? A special issue of the Cambridge Journal of Anthropology was dedicated to the spirited debate that ensued. It was not coincidental that the critique began with anthropology, whose claim to speak from the native's point of view has long been seen by the once colonized as the essence of appropriation. Yet similar anguished arguments soon followed in other disciplinary locations, in literature, in music, in classics, in STS, science and technology studies, and in the various aerial studies. In their introduction to the Cambridge collection on the topic, Mogstad and C in 2018 cited theory from the South, noting that decolonization should begin with a recognition of what we have conventionally seen as old margins of knowledge and production were in fact new frontiers, much of the critical insight coming from the colonial peripheries and largely unacknowledged. So there's been a process of absorption, various kinds of appropriation here. Now, the debates in England were significantly different from the one catching fire in America, especially as regards what colonization might mean there in America, a society that claims to have been victim but never perpetrator of colonialism, but that is currently being seen by many as it's sending occupying forces to its own cities. So there's a really interesting sense of occupation, and these things, the resonance of these terms keep returning. In the UK, colonization, and hence its overcoming, tends to be understood both in grounded geopolitical and geospatial terms and in theoretical historical terms. It's less a matter of essentializing identity, who has the right to speak about it and to whom, which is a very big issue in America, than a matter of critical perspective, who offers the most compelling critique of colonization, old and new, and what it might offer for those of us who seek to move beyond. As the Cambridge collection made clear, colonization in the UK critical debate was seen as a structural as well as an epistemic process. Much of the talk about this has come to focus on perspectives and modes of theory and so on. The UK debate was also interested in institutions and the lingering logic of institutional extraction after the end of formal colonialism. As the Cambridge collection made clear, the UK critical debate was seen as structural, though post-colonies were sites of the most enduring examples of colonialism in its classic form. It also was expanded by Europe, by people in England to think about Europe itself, not simply the question of the geographical south. I.e., they argued Europe was not merely a global metropole. It has also experienced internal empires with endogenous centers and peripheries. It has had its norths and souths. There's actually right now a publication called From the European South, Journal of the Post-Colonial Humanities, that's founded in Italy. And on the back there are internal discussions between North and South and the kind of notion of neo-colonialism within the country. As this was made evident also during the agonistic politics of Brexit, which made clear that processes of colonization can be seen to occur at varying interconnected scales and levels, one scaffolded on another. The exit from Europe in Britain itself pursued in the name of reclaiming national sovereignty, even global imperial stature, set in motion pressures in Scotland and Ireland and Wales for internal decolonization, the deuniting of the kingdom, as it were. Similar tensions exist within other nation states within Europe, of course, as I've said, not to mention the European Union's own centers and peripheries, as became very evident in the notion of Grexit and the kind of whole Greek parallel there of being on the margins, which paralleled the Brexit saga. As the scholarly approach in Cambridge, the scholarly approach in Cambridge is like the one we develop in theory from the South, which treats colonization as an inextricably politico-economic and cultural historical process. And while it has been most fully realized in modern history in the late 19th and early 20th century geographical South, it's not then limited to that hemispheric or temporal location. Just as I've implied that settler colonialism cannot be identified merely in South Africa or Australia and New Zealand, but also in North America and in Israel. Theories of decolonization that follow from this kind of approach draw on critical thinking from Euro-America's own internal dislocations, from its own imperial edges, often seeking to have these bodies of thought, North and South, in conversation with each other. So we might think of the dialogue fostered, say, between Marxist tendencies, Gramsci, who himself was a theorist, who saw himself as a person of the South, he was raised in Sardinia, and figures like Césaire, C.L.R. James, Fanon, Said, Chakrabarti, Mbembe, all of these people. The conversations go between those who have emerged out of the European inequities and those in the South. In the effort to understand modern colonialism and dismantle its hegemonic grip on the production and reproduction of social thought, a dialogic approach tries to relocate received traditions of critical thinking, traveling theories, ideas from the North that people like Fanon took to Africa and, as he said, stretched them, or repurposed ideas of social movements, of social action that moved from North, South, and back again. Jane Gordon, for instance, uses the idea of creolizing theory, allowing conversation to occur between various kinds, times, and places of critical thought. She, for instance, sets Fanon in conversation with Rousseau. Such approaches contrast with the effort to heal the corruption of Eurocentrism through a purifying confrontation with radical alterity. So this is one view of decolonialism, and it doesn't assume it's only simply the geographical North and South. But another very strong view looks from outside of the hegemonic system to indigenous others, indigenous ontologies, less compromised, less modern, discourse long suppressed, And this is the kind of position associated with people like Walter Mignolo on decoloniality, which many of you know. We will find our kind of lost direction, whether it's peace, ecology, politics, whatever, by moving to the worlds that have not been corrupted in the same way as we have. This is done, says de Souza Santos, by excavating the ruins of the marginalized, the suppressed, the silenced traditions upon which Euro-modernity built its own supremacy, and to do so on a world scale. In contrast, the kind of creolizing dialectical approach works with differences within what it sees already to be a completely interconnected and fully modern system. It is suspicious of margins that claim in some senses to be untouched, because all of them in many ways are products of this overarching global modern order. And so the approach that's more interested in the dialectic, the creolizing one, focuses on divisions and exclusions within both local systems and larger systems, and it puts them in conversation with each other, not assuming that there is a kind of romance, if you like, to be rediscovered in some kind of form of indigeneity that not itself has been drawn into the system. Of course, the concern with scholarship in the South has become a lively field in itself. There is a less radical but influential body of writing, for instance, that of Australian sociologist Raewyn Connell, called Southern Theory. This writing is about the kind of social thought that comes from the South as a specific geographic location and perspective from the periphery of European empire, and it's about the effort to overcome its subservience, its control over things like publication, as Les was mentioning, and so on. It's a struggle for a kind of equality and pluralization of the field of producing knowledge. Raynald Connell's book, Southern Theory, is an assembly of alternate Southern thought and theory into a kind of archive about the modern world produced from the South. And it's a rich catalogue of ideas of various kinds and political persuasions. So it stretches from Islamic, Indian, African, Latin American intellectual production, scholarly and popular, grassroots and elite. But it's there to document plurality. And Connell says she speaks of some theory not in the singular voice, but as it is not one Southern point of view, it's to foster a new world of social science, the many Souths. So this is the kind of project of including many voices, but not necessarily focusing on a particular political project, like, for instance, critique or liberation or peace or whatever. This is a very valuable exercise, but it does raise the question of what gives form, identity, and grounding to these diverse exemplars of Southern thought. In what sense do they qualify as contributors to Southern theory? And I'm going to talk in a moment about this next question of theory. Rather, are they not just forms of universal knowledge? What is the link between 19th century Iranian critics of Western materialism or early 20th century denunciators in Africa of land dispossession or artwork from contemporary indigenous Australians? What exactly is social theory here, and what more general discourse will it generate? And how does it look at this question that Achille Mbembe raised? What is the impact of the South on theory, general theory? So this is a particular kind of examination, but it doesn't lead us further into asking questions like, what really have been the processes that have configured this in unequal North and South and the way we see them in the first place? In fact, it's arguable that neither Northern or Southern theory, as I suggested earlier, is as unambiguously discrete a domain as Connell's perspective suggests. What about the relative centers and peripheries in each? Those parts of the North in the South, for instance, like the privileged enclaves here in relatively white South Africa or Brazil or Argentina, or those bits of the South in the North, like Haiti, or as we've seen, Greenland, or recently I visited Sicily. Yeah. And as I've noted, Australia, like South Africa or North America or Israel, is one of those microcosms of North-South interdependence within a single country, locked in a formation of a particular kind of settler history, settler colonialism. But Australia, of course, is also positioned in the southeast at global global geopolitical map. This is significant light on the epoch or shift I mentioned, where I see the dominant axis of north and south moving laterally from east to west as a kind of system of exchange, trade, aid, and so on. Significant also is the emergence of organizations like BRICS, the would-be economic bloc. We are seeing also evidence of shifts in the burgeoning relationship between Africa and China that is eclipsing former neo-colonial aid and development relations from the North, Europe and North America. And there's a lot of battleground. I've got a couple of students working on these issues of who's providing tech aid in places like Kenya, and there's a jockeying for positions, and each regarding the East looking askance at the West looking askance at China, and so on. So it's a very interesting situation, which is being managed very well here in Kenya, almost like it was during the Cold War, and with the many recurring features of the Cold War era, I think, that we have at present. Australia, for instance, is interesting because its top three trade partners are China, Japan, and Korea, and yet it sees itself resolutely as this kind of Commonwealth-wide nation. So the interesting tensions here in the way that the whole system is being reconfigured. In this region, complex economic interdependence and power play, where imperial ambitions are experimenting with new kinds of soft and harder power, new digital financial forms of dependency and existing control are being built up. The East-West relationship is, or not all, love and peace. It's a form, many argue, of a new kind of imperialism. It has its own engagements and its own centers and periphery. The era of Trump 2.0 is playing into all this in complex ways, strengthening the will of various nations within and beyond Europe to lessen the entanglement on the US with its dollar, while the universe also has centers, and peripheries. It seems to defy simple spatial dichotomies of North and South in the ways that we still use them, and all of us still use them. And so it's a moving map that we have to think about very carefully. There are dangers, there are incredibly positive possibilities. The work of decolonization, as by De Souza Santos, also is a significant arena of decolonial thinking. He comes from Portugal, which is interesting because, again, it's on Europe's periphery. After all, it's often said that Africa starts at the Pyrenees, right? That Portugal and Spain are actually part of it from the point of view of Northwestern European thinking. Such complex placement of individual scholars and thinkers and the array of people around them make one intimately aware of the fact that, as Edward Said put it long ago, culture and theory travels. But in the process, it is also continually being creolized, the ongoing give and take, intentional and otherwise, with modes of thought from outside its borders. In that sense, again, modernity is always being remade. And as Bruno Latour has written, if we understand modernity to be only a pure system of knowledge and practice, then we have none of us have ever been modern. Right? It's always open to, notwithstanding the ideology of systematization and privileging, it's always open to this fluid exchange. So if you think of Christianity, capitalism, urbanism, social movements, have all been reconfigured in Africa, India, Asia, and Latin America as part of an expansive global conversation that goes on despite the efforts of European civilizers to colonize the consciousness of their subjects. I always say to my students, I give them an exam question. In Africa, has Christianity been colonized or Africa been Christianized? It's a really fascinating question because in many senses, Christianity is more vitally alive on this continent, more creatively remade, more figuring itself into a promotion of social welfare than I've seen in the North. So in Europe itself, it's never free also from hybridization within its internal divides. And there's been further cross fertilization and discourse in practice in its actually existing empires. Its putatively universal thoughts have been rethought and engineered in Southern conditions. So the historical process gives rise to all kinds of creolization. Maybe these theories are often claimed in a way by the North, but you think about things like dependency theory, liberation theology, the work of Fanon, theories of racial capitalism, very hot now in the academy in America, started initially in thinking about the labor process under apartheid in South Africa, migrated to the Open University via Stuart Hall, was rethought there, and went with Cedric Robinson to America, and there to be fertilized again by a whole tradition of Black radicalism. So these ideas are very mobile, and this has only been enhanced in many ways by digitalization, which has brought us a lot of other ills, but there's also brought great advantages in this regard. So the process is seen also in the reforms of institutions. If you think about the way that the social compact, which is winding down, is being threatened in many of the former welfare societies in the North, and certainly in America, that never was only one part partially. But the way that social grants work in Brazil, conditional cash transfers, or the basic income grant has been rethought, and social grants work here in South Africa. You see all kinds of things going on, including also things like the invention of forms of transitional justice, the role of environmental justice that has come out of places like Colombia in their truth and reconciliation process and so on. So these are highly mobile, and the people move and the ideas move, and people try to brand them and to put stamp on them, but they escape and they migrate. So Santos seems to be expressing a similar sensibility to what I've argued in Theory from the South, with his idea of Southern epistemologies. He speaks about bottom-up, what he calls subaltern cosmopolitanism, to counter what he calls the epistemicide of Northern universalism, with its unceasing effort to erase rich variety of other ways of knowing, other languages, other forms of self-representation. As I understand it, this cosmopolitanism for him is born of the struggle of marginalized people everywhere against forms of economic and governmental domination, forms of patriarchy and so on, but also just the poverty of being absorbed into what are former colonial societies. A dynamic that amounts to an unceasing process of intercultural translation in forms like Nesta Sahe, or indeed in the thinking about decolonization. So the aim here is less to replace Northern epistemology. The very notion of an elite, disembodied knowledge production sphere separated from practice is what Santos is trying to overcome. Now, this has certain appeal, although its practicality is again, it needs to be thought through. But he's suggesting that the power hierarchies that create these kind of rather isolated worlds of expertise insulate themselves from this kind of dynamic cosmopolitanism that you see often in more popular culture, more grassroots movements and so on. The power, so what Dos Santos says is that power elites in the North operate with what he calls an abyssal line that separates Northern experts from those that they declare to be ethno-nationally inferior. For Santos, the line fundamentally entraps indigenous scholars within the ideologies of the North. Yeah? They either play that game or they're completely outside of it. He also sees scholars in the North as irredeemably caught in their own epistemological hegemonies. So even, for instance, ultra radical feminists who work with Fanonian ideas, for him, they're all contaminated because they still work in this idea of rather abstract theory from elite positions, and they're not engaged in the actual work of grounded praxis. Those who wish to end the empire theory, he says, must find emancipatory scripts that are being developed beyond the limits of Western-centric politics and knowledge. Some of those approaches are foreign to Northern thinking, he says, but some of them have been remade in the South, almost unrecognizably, in forms of kind of law, democracy, and the state. Now, there's a lot to like in this vision. He's very, the thing about this kind of vision is that it's not nihilistic. It's not defeatist in the face of what we're confronting even now. And a lot of it overlaps with what my husband and I have written ourselves. At the same time, the position raises some key questions for me. Above all, I'm unsure how to read the status of the argument. Is he actually saying this is what's going on, or is it something that ought to be going on? This is a problem with a lot of this kind of aspirational thinking. It often slips between characterizing what it's describing and arguing for what should be our task of moving forward. Santos's position strikes me as admirable in its rejection of nihilism, and this is no small virtue at a time where the mood of ecological and political doom, at least the centers I know in the US, and Afro-pessimism would render even decolonization irrelevant and impossible. It's just a question of kind of learning to die in the with what we have, and to deepen the well experience of history. One understands where it comes from, particularly now. It's very hard to be a teacher in many places. But at the same time, Santos puts his hope, but the hope here is still placed on rescue from some kind of outside. And that outside is still seemed to exist somehow beyond the reaches of this whole global interconnected order that we're talking about, and particularly the long impact of colonialism having commodified and monetized and to a large extent raided many of the societies in the South. So the question here is, I mean, is this a romance? How do we think about this world of the possible, the relative outsides, because there's also a very strong sense here that if we uncouple ourselves from our Western corruption, we can somehow find a kind of elemental simplicity. And this is often a position peddled by many of us sitting in fully fledged positions in the North, who don't really have often much of a sense of what that might mean in terms of real, say, ecological theory or ideas of community government or whatever. So there's something very interesting about it too. But I think we have to also be a trifle. I guess I don't believe that there are any untouched utopias, but that doesn't mean that we can't presume that we can make claims in terms of something other than where we are now. In fact, I find it hard to translate several features of this argument, despite its appeal, into actual socio-historical or practical terms, which is necessary if we are to move, as the likes of De Santis want, beyond the traffic in philosophical abstractions. Can one really claim that, other than as an aspirational ideal, Southern cosmopolitanism rejects divisiveness and monopolization? These are the sorts of things that are claimed for the kind of looking for where there's a less alienated or an unalienated form of thinking about the world. Such statements to me would seem to appear to reinforce the dualistic, not to mention the universalizing qualities that Western thinking is accused of. While there is overwhelming evidence of the repudiation by colonized peoples of their enslavement, dispossession, alienation, and defiance has seldom involved a wholesale rejection of the promises of modernity and development. This is the question. I mean, besides, after the onslaughts of colonialism, there are very few real indigenous worlds to retreat to. although claim making in the name of indigenous rights is hugely important and is a tremendous area, i.e. the strategic claiming of that voice for the purposes of making certain kinds of arguments of at least relative alienation from some of the problems that we see at the center is useful. But in all this, learning the universal history of colonialism and the extractive wars of capitalism and liberal warfare are all important. It seems to me in societies that are seeing the immediate effects of a long history of deprivation, they need to know, that they want to know something more, something larger about the making of this world in the here and now. What is more, struggle and suffering do not always ennoble people. Anti-colonial resistance has often simultaneously favored local patriarchs, authoritarian traditionalism, and new categories of privilege brokers, not all of them peacemakers. It is also sought to indigenize the power of ruling colonial discourses and practices, not least tapping into the energy, profit, and charisma of capitalist markets. Colonial societies have often responded to the millennial appeal of Christian salvation, sometimes for emancipation, hugely so. I mean, in the history of South Africa and the likes of Mandela, the national anthem all bear testimony to the unintended consequences of mission education, and often to espouse new kinds of universalism and possibility. But they also, some of the most conservative ethno-national forces now in African societies on matters of sexuality and gender and so on, also come from branches of Christianity. So it doesn't go all in one direction. Again, one needs the local knowledge to be able to see where these forms have come from and how they've taken shape. Many subjects of empire, as Santos implies, have been attracted to liberal ideas like democracy, statehood, and social contract, often pushing them in communitarian directions. Sometimes, though, as Fanon saw, they also have given rise to predatory forms of bourgeois or ethnic nationalism. To be sure, the worlds invaded by European colonialism were shaped in important respects by the experience of overrule that laid bare the contradictions of Euro-modernity. You have to understand the master society very well, more than he can understand it himself, if you're going to be able to live with it. And that's one of the insights of the great South African writers like Nadine Gordimer. African societies, for instance, made significant sacrifices also in 2 world wars in Europe. And from that, they saw a good deal about the wider world and brought it back into the unified anti-imperial movements that shaped Pan-Africanism, the non-aligned movement. Now, many people now looking back to these movements at a time which looks in some ways like the old Cold War. Perhaps this is what Dos Santos means when he talks about subaltern cosmopolitanism. These movements also suggest a worldly comparative sensibility. That's what I find so interesting, is that people that sometimes live on the very fringes of what are organized markets and transport systems are receiving commodities and communications from elsewhere on which they build an incredibly sophisticated understanding of how they're connected to the rest of the world, rather than simply set off. At the same time, the wider world of Southern modernity has also produced its own demagogues, its new imperialists, its own rapacious forms of capitalism with Southern characteristics. In the US, as many of us know, the debate about decolonization has been somewhat different. And here I speak from the vantage of anthropology and African studies. There's been a very much more assertive effort in this context to link colonization to the American experience. Like most things, they bring it home, right? Comes home, past and present. To interpret deepening generational and ethno-racial differences as symptoms of long histories of enslavement, incarceration, and internal colonialism. In anthropology in America right now, which is in complete disarray, some younger critics accuse the discipline of being entrapped in a form of liberal humanism that fuels a kind of ethnographic sentimentalism and an inability to engage with the really urgent issues of the moment. In the US, then, decolonization, like most things, tends to be framed as a domestic matter. focused on the need to combat right now what is going on in the country, a kind of militarized ethno-nationalism, a war on liberalism, especially in the universities, and the ever-going precaritization and incarceration of racially marked populations. One should note that precarity, while it may be relatively new for certain white populations in the US, is hardly novel for people of color,
4 p.m.
who, like decolonized populations before them, have always had less civic protection or exposure to bare life, as Agamben calls it. The call for scholarly decolonization, especially in anthropology or African studies, is not unprecedented. Again, long ago in colonial South Africa, scholars like Archie Mafeje saw precisely the uses and the abuses of anthropology and disciplines like it that could easily be made a handmaid of European empire, objectifying peoples in the South and naturalizing colonial rule. But it also has been the source of critical insight and the rise of certain kinds of local forms of organization and self-consciousness. And the same could be said for, and I won't go into this now if anybody's interested, area studies like African studies is a huge battleground in the US. Who owns it, whether there's a right, anybody who's not living and from Africa has a right to it, has become a matter of identity as much as of scholarship. And it's a very brutally fought battle. Some have also argued that in contexts like North America, where the category of the colonized, as I noted, has been extended to include descendants of chattel slavery and contemporary imprisoned populations, they've argued that decolonization has come to be used as a metaphor for indiscriminately for a range of struggles for social justice. Thus, Tuck and Yang suggest that, especially in settler colonial contexts, the term should be reserved for the repatriation of indigenous land and life, lest it become an empty signifier, an omnibus synonym for emancipation, as I said, decolonial yoga. The underspecification of the term has also invoked other objections, interestingly, some again from Africa. Jwahi Lee, who works with Tanzanian bioscientists, says that decolonization needs to be wary of encouraging colonization. Tanzanian experts struggle for equity of participation and recognition, he says, in the global science project on which they've been working and with which they strongly identify. They do not identify themselves with African science as a unique indigenous form of knowledge. Rather, they want to make their own African contribution to a universal modernist science and to be accorded the power and access that accrues to the production of such state-of-the-art knowledge. For them, if decolonization is to mean anything, it would involve being able to take ownership of scientific knowledge production in their own country, not to be associated with a realm of hybrid, alternative borderland discourse. So, conclusion. In sum, this is a field of argument. And it's in relation to this that I would think that the ideas of theory from the South need to be read and thought about. Depending on how you see it, that book was just another text from two people who grew up as white elites, albeit, a la Bourdieu, as a dominated fraction of a dominant class, and who now speak from an elite university in the North. From that perspective, the kind of theory making we advocate remains too concerned with the general, if critical, approaches to the making and unmaking of large forces like modern empires, global capitalism, and so on. We are thus hopelessly universalist, always seeking to read the particular local situation and problems that emerge in terms of vectors of larger world making. The project remains hopelessly Eurocentric, whatever it may say. It's had its day and it should be decolonized. To be sure, the position I've outlined does reject the idea that there are discrete communal or indigenous outsides to capitalist modernity that promise some form of rescue from our communal global predicament. Although there certainly are margins, resistant local worlds, creolized peripheries that generate friction and critical insight. In fact, the argument in theory from the South starts from a similar position to calls for decolonization. that modern Western hegemonies have always presumed that knowledge production, the nature of truth, the genesis of theory, and the means of civilization are located in the North, while the objects, inquiries, and expropriations are to be found in the South. The latter might be a source of data, but it is often not being recognized by those who speak in the universal source, a voice for those who speak of the universal voice as a source of world-making, theory-making, or knowledge production. Indeed, of revising perhaps what we might think of as knowledge or science in the first place. Many of my colleagues here, African colleagues, have had the experience of being spoken to, these are professors of global reputation, as if they were informants and referred to as informants in the writings of certain northern scientists. My informant told me, and they actually consulting a professor of chemistry. But the key difference that we've emphasized in theory from the South is that the relationship between North and South is dialectical and reciprocally transforming, albeit unequal in determination. I mean, not everybody has the same force in this, it's not reciprocal, but the impact is ongoing. In many ways, the South has long experienced what it is to live with and understand poverty and precarity. In fact, the very knowledge that emerges as part of the hegemony in and of the North in its institutions of higher learning and disciplines is often appropriated by the South by plagiarizing or mimicking the insights of its theorists. For as it is with the workings of the extractive economy, the South is by and large still treated simply as a source of essential raw materials, notwithstanding everything we know about the current world order. But in all this, we are asking also, what is theory? Who makes it? Who are the theory-making classes? Is it a matter of the thinker and their poor, as Rancière would have it? How does theory relate to policy? What is the relationship between theory and praxis? Yeah. One of the things we are arguing in theory from the South is that the fetishism of theory itself is precisely what we need to get away from. Theory is seen as a kind of thinking and writing set apart from ordinary experience and implementation. It doesn't arise from the stuff of the everyday world, but from some kind of external godlike position. In contrast, by theory, I mean at least, ideas that are engaged in life and that emerge from practice largely, whether from farmers or factory workers or digital programmers or professors. Without thinking about it, we all contemplate and speculate to be able to live. We cannot live without hypothesizing and predicting, theorizing, in other words. So theory from the margins of class, race, gender, and sexuality has always been central to critical theory. And often, and even although that theory often seeks to ignore it, and it's often from those places that you find the more naturalized levers of power, the everyday experiences in body, in language, in gesture, beyond formal institutions, the insults, but also the recognitions that come from lived realities. Now, some have called this poor theory, subaltern theory, theories from below, theory from the margins, but it's from here that significant revelatory insights in the contemporary order of things is coming, although that knowledge and insight is often again appropriated by metropolitan discourse. But in our current, present multilateral world, such monopolizations have become increasingly hard to sustain. This is not merely because of the ways in which Europe has been provincialized, increasingly outflanked by the development of non-Western centers of economic, cultural, and technological innovation. The obsession of the current US leadership, saving Western civilization, makes that uncertainty very evident. In a time of radical globalization of capital, of production, of the division of labor, the oligarchs from the centers of empire in the North have responded to the growing displacement by dropping any pretense of international accord or post-colonial reciprocity, increasingly all aid and development. You get statements from things like the Brookings Institution, make Africa great again, drop all aid and development, wean it from aid and development. And there's a doubling down on ethno-nationalist self-interest, a kind of isolationism, and military adventurism abroad using what we've seen, tariffs, aid, blackmail, armaments, what Achille Mbembe calls necropolitics. So corporate techno-capital has not only freed itself more and more from government regulation and taxation, it has in several places captured the state. We thought that we'd seen state capture in South Africa. Well, welcome to the new US. And it's become the driver of international relations ever more overtly. Ever more mobile, competitive gangster abstraction, not only in Euro-America, seeks to monopolize diminishing resources in minimally regulated zones and often former colonies, places where structural underdevelopment and poverty and hunger still reign. There is great incentive to accept such overtures, to process the waste, to take on the starvation level jobs for the sake of benefiting the larger population. No one remains unaffected by these disciplines, these developments. In many ways, those seeking to remove the rights and protections of ordinary citizens and workers in the North introduce a kind of neo-colonial circumstance in what were once welfare states. America is a third world country now, said McGirt and Jenkins recently in an article in one of the leading American newspapers. Others have talked about Dennis McShane, who was a representative of Britain in the EU, talked about Banana Republic Britain suffering from a political Ebola virus. Western citizens may have been reduced in many places to the status of colonial subjects, with reduction in their protection as civil beings. So in the face of these historical shifts, it follows, and this is key to the argument in theory of the South, that we should look at former colonial peripheries for insight into the unfolding of the global order at large. Not only do these margins make evident the innovative experimental edges of our interconnected planetary economy, one that knows how to make good with less because they've had to all along. Contra many theorists of decolonization, these realities are not only matters of epistemology or ideology, and they're not cut off from the world. It also follows that because of the contradictions of late modern capitalism have been more shamelessly visible along these frontiers, it's often where the most creative thinking emerges. And new experiments in social organization and retribution. I'm amazed at how much of the journalism here in South Africa reflects more acutely what's going on in the US in relation to the wider world than what I read in the US itself. But it follows too that these new zones of energy, value production, and profit making are also sites of new kinds of exploitation and colonization, often in the name of aid and development. And this we know in Africa, for instance, around issues of land loss and privatization and so on, often done in the name of development and bringing jobs that never come. So we really can and never overlook how that colonialism in a way doesn't have an end. One of the key insights of writers on decoloniality is that the process of overall itself cannot be reduced to formal decolonization, but it exists in more insidious processes of control over the psyches, the cultures, the bodies, the material lives of those it seeks to profit by, both in its soft and harder forms. As this all suggests, there's no simple way to roll back the status quo or the effects of colonial histories to recover the lost world as it might have existed before the Midas touch of the avaricious world. I really don't believe that that's a possibility. But certainly more nuanced understandings are needed to allow us to work within the insidious entanglements of the global world we share, and to listen carefully along those frontiers to think about more sustainable forms of maintaining collective life. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jean Comaroff, for this brilliant presentation. And wow, we've definitely learned a lot from you on the theory from the South and the debates about decolonization. And you've talked about a number of issues that are very, interesting and pertinent to our understanding of our lives really in general, but especially about decolonization, issues of tribalism, nationalism, authoritarianism, precarity, capitalism, imperialism, and the Western hegemony, etc. And you just also mentioned how to, first of all, the debates that you have just mentioned about implications of colonizing or decolonizing the syllabus, particularly in anthropology, or scholarly decolonization. You've talked about recognition of and acknowledgement of inputs from the South. And you've tackled the question of identity, the need for critical perspective or critical debate. You've talked about colonial, political, economic, and social processes that are involved in our understanding of decolonization. But you also talked about equality in knowledge production and about the North-South interdependence. And that you said that I found quite interesting, that culture and theory travel, and that modernity is always remade, and talked about issues of environmental justice, talked about femicide, and you, of course, also talked about the issues of Pan-Africanism, non-aligned movement, but also ownership of scientific knowledge production, and talked about the nature of truth, also the relationship between theory and practice, or theory and policy, and talking is one thing, but then putting it into practice is another. Now, I would like really to ask members here present to ask questions, make comments, share their own experiences. As we can see, we are coming from all over the world, and so glad that we are all here. Lester, please, welcome.
Hi. So I'm breaking my own rules here by having the Americans speak first. It really belies what we've just heard. But I'm fascinated with the really remarkable presentation. Thanks, Gene. I'm really interested in what you had to say about dependency theory. And I was unaware of its origins in South Africa. I'm gonna look that up. I really think it's fascinating.
Racial capitalism, dependency
racial
theory comes from
capitalism.
Latin America. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But dependency theory. What I've learned from my African wife,
Latin America.
her research is that that actually dependency. We've grown to think of dependency as dependency of the South on the North, when in fact the North relied on the South, was dependent on the South for the creation of the industrial and the modern global economy, and with raw materials and cheap labor and so on. But now what you've also talked about, which I found really fascinating, is our dependency on theory from the South. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, how you think about dependency theory.
Yeah. Dependency theory or underdevelopment theory is a very large topic on its own, right? And people like Walter Rodney and Gunther Frank, it's got its theorists. But the thing that I always found interesting about teaching it, particularly here in South Africa, is that the way that world systems theory talked about centers and semi-centers and peripheries and so on makes complete sense to people in classrooms here, sometimes the first generation who'd come to college, because in fact they'd experienced it in their own families with migrant labor, with the question of the goods that came and didn't come before the end of apartheid and then came afterwards, and the whole way in which i.e. it was a very organic kind of perception to them. But dependency theory, of course, has its particular history and a particular moment of explaining how, Europe underdeveloped Africa. And it's strong. I mean, a lot of what I've said here, I always feel that in a way one has to overstate these things to make them even heard. And it comes across as very strident and all or none. Yeah. But the reciprocal nature of interdependence is what is interesting to me. And that although a dialectic doesn't always have to be co-produced with equals, you can be profoundly affected by those that you're dominating in some ways. And that's the genius of Fanon's writing on race and Hegel on master and slave. And I think that's basically the idea that lies behind some of this. But one does not want to underplay the continuing significance of this. That while the likes of Rodney and the Latin American theorists and, the people who wrote about the world system and so on were writing at a time, of high, colonial economies, this continues in so many ways. I mean, so much of, and not only here, I mean, if you look at the ways in which the new platform forms of capitalism are making money all over the world and are paying taxes practically nowhere. And that the whole problem that's facing our planet that makes dependency, if you like, a global issue that is lateral, not only linear, has to do with inequality and what that means and the lack of regulation of the terms of trade and extraction and so on. It remains a hugely significant issue. I mean, here in Africa, large proportion of the mining wealth, of the mineral wealth, is not owned by not even corporations that are national, they're transnational. And we're seeing this again with the new empires that are rushing for scarce minerals and so on. The war in Eastern Congo is kept alive by the very things that we need to keep the laundered green economy in the north rolling, right? So, and the kind of the blood lithium and the things that are produced. So we don't make those connections. And that connection to globalize the world, that's why the writing of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, where he drew the connection between the slave plantation to the north of America, to the new merchant classes, or C.L.R. James, who's wonderful, Black Jacobins, was the first thing to really describe that whole global economy and the moral interdependencies that weren't all one way. But I mean, I think with that kind of theory, one always has to work with cases as well, so that one's thinking is very much honed to the particularities of histories, of what's being used, what goes back and forth, the interdependencies and so on. But yeah, I mean, I think that the story, and particularly now, where, the question of I mean, we had a fabulous paper a couple of weeks ago in our workshop like this, about the fact that we're living in a world where most of us now are going to suffer things that are resistant to antibiotics. So the antibiotic era is over. And the structures of production in the global north are not such they're prepared to invest capital in the long duration of developing new antibiotics. Yeah. So where is that coming from? It's coming from China. It's coming from South Africa, where you have private-public partnerships, but also an idea of public health and the social good. It's coming from Russia, where they never used antibiotics to the same degree, but used a completely different system of macrophages, which is now being brought in to save some of them. So the interdependencies of life and death, of economy and morality are very, complex, and they're ongoing. What worries me about decolonialism, people think you can do it and then you're in the clear. There are multiple forms of colonization that are ongoing. We're sitting surrounded by them now. I know we have little time. Sorry.
Thank you.
I can go on.
Thank you very much indeed, Madeline, and then Janet. Welcome, Madeline.
Thank you so much, Prof. That was so wonderful. I particularly appreciate where you have cited and well referenced C.R. James, Webb Du Bois, and even Fanon, as you have referenced him in your conversation. So I read Fanon, Richard of the Earth, where he gave us the definition of what he of course believed decolonization looks like. And one part I really like about is Fanon's definition of decolonization is where he said that decolonization is simply the replacing of a certain species of men by another species of men. And he went further to say that decolonization, which of course is set out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. And people have said, of course, that Fanon advocated violence in his work and whatnot. So my question is, in your opinion, Prof, what would theoretically, of course, would decolonization really looks like in the context of today's dark world, as you said, where we have a new colonial and a more subtle colonization of the mind, bodies, and what would that look like for you? And also, I like the part where you reference, of course, the state capture in South Africa. I laughed a little bit because I think what is going on in South Africa is a re-state capture. I mean, can you capture an already captured state? So I think what is going on in South Africa and everywhere in Africa, on the continent, is quite really crazy. So yeah, that is my question. I think I had another question. And of course, where the book you were reading from, if you would please, if there's a way we can have an e-copy of that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, do you have a central process for me to send you like an online book that you can, in case people want it? Either that or write to me, because I can get it to you.
You can share it with me.
I can get
Jean,
an
and then I will share
electronic
it
version. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Madeleine, that's a very big question because, of course, I mean, Fanon, when he was writing The Wretched of the Earth, this is a call to arms, right? It's a very passionate book, and it exaggerates the everything to make its point because it's a call to arms. He also, however, says that when you replace one species of mankind with another, there's no guarantee that it's not going to reproduce a version of what was there before. And this is his caution against the overtaking of one bourgeoisie by another, because he was also a Marxist of a kind, right? And he believed that class was important, not only race and class. So yeah, I mean, the question, if thinking about a world of colonization or place like South Africa, you can't be all or none. South Africa had a political revolution, but not an economic one. And unfortunately, while there's a considerably more freedom now than there was before, there still is great inequity of land holding, and the difference in wealth between black and white in South Africa is greater than it was under apartheid. And that has everything to do also with how capitalism has hollowed out the middle everywhere in terms of creating worlds of extreme wealth and extraordinary precarity. So it's difficult, but I think where one starts is where one is. I always feel it's hopeless. One's got to think big, and then one's got to start where you are. So in terms of things like the university, who gets there? What is the syllabus? What are the forms of control? I mean, we've seen what's happened to the universities in America now. I mean, we've reverted to the most extraordinary. I mean, it's like I'm reliving apartheid every day there, right? When I see what goes on. So one has to start, and everybody has their own personal politics and so on, but I always think where you work, consumer boycotts, what you will do. You don't buy from Starbucks because they won't unionize. Some of us will not. So these are symbolic, maybe, but you have to start with your moral self, and you can also start with things wherever your workplace, whatever it is that you come in touch with, is my way of thinking about this, because there are different degrees. I mean, if you're thinking empire now in terms of the forms of capitalism, there are people who actually go off grid, because they feel this is the only way they can begin to think about decolonization, unless they're working with alternatives. So it can be a completely strangulating, and this is where things like Afro-pessimism, or those people who feel that the Anthropocene is a die that's cast and there's nothing we can do but to try and ethically just accept our fate. That's the kind of nihilism that I don't accept, but then I'm a child of the 60s. I still believe that you have to do something, right? But I do believe that one has to think large and try and, where do the goods come from? Just one's everyday life, in the way one consumes, the way one for instance, in the US now, there are all kinds of interesting forms of mutuality that are emerging. The resistance of certain kinds of commercial institutions, the making visible certain forms of protest. That's a very extreme example. But on the small level, the monopolization of life, the commodification of life, the turning of us all and our social relationships into commodities. We're seeing it now in the debate about the internet and what's doing to young people. It's colonizing their lives. That word is used again and again. Yeah, I can't go on, but because we're running out of time. But thanks for the question. It'll have me thinking, and I'll send the book to George.
Great, great. Let's take two other last questions from Janet and then Munyaradzi, and then we will wind up for today. And then, of course, Liu Cheng would like to say something, and so the three, and then we will, afterwards, of course, we can stay, behind just for networking, meet, greet, stay, and enjoy. So, Janet, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Okay. Thank you, Jean, for your brilliant erudite presentation. And I feel that I love this word creolization. I feel that's why I'm here in this, coming from New York, to get creoletized by the interactions from people all over, especially from Africa, who, always bringing a beginner's mind to the situation. I want to share one. When I first went to the university as a retired person from being a choreographer, and my teacher said, theory is just what someone said. And I thought that's a brilliant way to describe decolonization of theory. And
It's an interesting.
yeah, because for an intimidated, person entering into the academy, and then I think from the other end of my academic training, I think theory helps us zoom in and zoom out and try to, we have to take an overview, right? And then, like you said, but also not lose touch with the practice. So anyway, we work a lot in what I do with reflective inquiry and the guiding question. And I'm just wondering, what's your guiding question of your research in this moment? Obviously, you have to give a short answer because of time, but, it's sort of like leaving us with the thought of where to follow you next.
Do you want to take the questions, George, and then I speak at the end? Or do you want me to answer now?
That's right. Please, Munyaradzi and Liu Cheng, and then she will respond
Janet.
to all of them.
Thank you, Jean. Yeah.
Munyaradzi.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you, Jean, for this wonderful insights into theory from the South. And my question is closely related, I think, to Janet, is because I was also wondering, whether or not, we can see decoloniality as a theory, because, most of the decolonial scholars who are writing, they don't call their work, or they don't call it a theory, I think most of them prefer to call it a perspective rather than a theory, because to some extent, a theory is seen as something that is closed and into which you cannot add anything.
Yeah.
But if you leave it open-ended, then it can be cross-fertilized, from all different parts of the contributions. So I just want to find your whether you think decolonization qualifies as a theory for that matter. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Liu Cheng. You're welcome, Liu. Please unmute your microphone.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor Jean, for your really, really interesting and I benefited a lot from your lecture. And I'm professor for world history. I learning a little bit about empire or colonialism or decolonialism. When we talk about colonialism usually connected with the independence of the countries of colonialism. But when we think about Britain, they have two kinds of empire. One empire we usually call former empire. It means British to send army to occupy African land. The second one is informal empire. So, and the truth is, after independence of African countries, or maybe other colonialism countries, the gap between the African countries and the European countries, even the decolonialism, the gap become bigger than before. So my question is, the empire is full because of their independence, every countries. But it only depends, this is only is about the former empire. But the informal empire is continued, but much more stronger, even after African countries' independence. This is about dependence theory. So,
that's right.
So we never cut the colonial link between African countries and the European countries. So maybe this is the real reason, even after independence of African countries, the economic couldn't develop by themselves or use their suitable the mode of their African model to develop their economic, but any also for the European countries, the former colonial, the empire. I'm not sure, but it's a very interesting thing you can find China, Japan, and South Korea. And these kind of countries of economic develop very, very fast, but we don't speak English or European language to be our national language. But return to African countries, English and French also to be their national language. It means they couldn't cut the informal empire link. I'm not sure this is the reason. So this is my questions. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, this is. I'll go with you first. That is very interesting. Of course, I mean, I'm talking about the difference between formal and informal empire, and of course, the cynical world historical realization is after World War II, it became apparent that it was possible to get what you needed from empires from colonies. Because there's a big difference between colony and empire. Now, a colony means the formal present structures of government with all of the costs of and the institutions and so on. Empire is extraction and influence, but not the responsibility for running the government, ostensibly, although you can run the government informally. But after World War II, the cynical view is that it was more effective for northern countries to extract without the responsibility of governance, right? The whole world had changed and they did, but the relationship remained. But what was different was that in Africa during the Cold War, it opened countries up to other kinds of influence. And then language was not the only important thing. But for instance, during the Cold War, most African colonies that had been with Britain or France also pivoted towards Russia. And of course, increasingly they pivoted towards China. And what you see now is the jockeying for influence. If you go to Djibouti or you go to Nairobi, you'll see that the tech companies that are vying, the French, the Americans, the Chinese are all there together. The nature of the relationship is somewhat different. There are always interpreters to deal with the language, but you have the same kind of sense of making informal links. And the big debate is, from the Chinese point of view, what is different about the form of trade and engagement and business as against, and what China has going for it is that South-South relationship that doesn't have the heritage of North-South empire. But many, of course, accuse China of building empires, right? And the Chinese see the British still continuing their imperial role. So it's a very interesting standoff. But you're quite right. There's a difference between the formal and the informal. And the informal, in a way, opens the door often to much more varied plural extraction. But a lot of the ownership, and the school curricula, and even the teachers in the schools for decades after colonialism, you still had African children here speaking with Scottish accents because all the teachers at school were Scottish. So that continued, and it's a very interesting point you're making. And I think that the presence of China and of Asia in Africa and in Latin America has been transformative. And it exists at every level, from individual Chinese families making business to state level or state proxy corporations and so on. And the Chinese have taken over big state development, not just commercial development. So it's a very interesting thing. The question of my question. I mean, I think my question is the question of creolization. And I want to go back to that one because the person who talked about is actually my daughter. She's a political theorist, and she writes about them. She wrote about Fanon and Rousseau, and her husband is Lewis Gordon, the Jamaican Fanonist. So we have a family creolization going on in our. And I agree with you completely that the question of theory, and this gets to the question about theory that you raised, that was Munya Razi. I don't know that I'd call them theory. You see, I would turn the question over and say, we should be less exclusive and kind of godlike about what we mean by theory. Theories are conjectures about how things happen in the world. They're observations, and they can congeal into theory with a capital T. But they can also they can die, or they can have a life if they strike gold, right? And so that would be the word that's used much more by decolonizers is epistemology, right? I.e., as you say, point of view. But that also is a big word. And I find people in the general public understand theory more easily than they do epistemology. That's a kind of philosophical term. But I think that the point here is that it's the mobility between these things. And it's why, actually, as a social scientist, I would say, Janet, that these days good journalists do much better work than most social scientists because they're more nimble. They have to make conclusions on the spot, and they have to, so they engage with, and as long as they're not part of political machines, which is very hard for them not to be, they often do what we do, which is on the spot, quick summations, translation, exchange of ideas. But that's what I think it's about. And I think that this kind of forum is fantastic. It's interestingly like ours. I'm going to talk to you, George, about the way that we might occasionally intersect, because we are on the very much the same kind of, and we have the same distribution of people across the globe. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much indeed, Jean. And I would like to really thank you from the bottom of my heart for being with us.
Thank you.
Today. And definitely I would like to thank also everybody here today. And we haven't met for 2 months. It has been very, very long. So thank you for being here with us, and welcome again next week. Actually, we're going to continue with the topic of decolonization and retelling our stories. So I'm looking forward to seeing you again. And thank you again also, Jean, for this invitation for collaboration. And thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye. We are going to stop the recording now. And so please, if you join me for an applause for Jean.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.